Are you in the waiting room?
You want me to answer your question on what do I think the role of police should be?
Sure. Do you want to start with what do you feel like the problem is, and then maybe see
What do I feel like the
how
problem
it goes?
is? And are you okay? So I guess when we're particularly discussing a problem with policing, there's a bunch of like systemic problems that police officers have basically just taken up a job for and like attempt to solve by like over policing people. So like for example, a lot of us went to USC. What's the biggest thing that DPS, LAPD are super keen on is fucking with homeless people because there aren't really a bunch of resources and stuff for those people to get access for all the things that they may need, whether it be mental health, whether it be necessary education, whether it be, like honestly like generic healthcare. Like some people's like debilitating medical conditions just end up like getting them into homelessness and stuff like that, right? And that's just like one capacity of how policing basically adds on more responsibilities to what they're like originally there for. I think the thing is, as the politicizing of police just makes it like more and more complicated, right? Because certain people are of the faith that adding more police will be beneficial for communities because it prevents like I guess potential dangerous situations. But also, I mean, same people or a lot of other people from one perspective or from the opposite perspective would say adding more police just adds fuel to the flame, and people are like kind of like what Marcus said. All these situations that continue to happen, it's like they are increasingly more tense because of the propagation of historical examples that precede. And so I think, whether you're considering from the perspective of a police officer of like, oh, I don't want to be that one that gets caught and then like my whole life's over. Cause like, I mean, realistically, for how many of these shootings happen, the amount of like people that actually face punitive justice is like very, very small percentage, right? And so like more importantly is like I think people are just like really worried of being like, oh, I don't want to be that like poster child of like what not to be. But then, people are emboldened by other people that allow them to be, a certain type of way. So I think it's a two things. So society needs to start checking police and then police need to start checking police as well. And then kind of what Marcus was talking about originally, people need to basically decide what is the role of police. It's and not start like adding extra functions to it, not start like reinterpreting what theories of punishment are and this that and the other. It's like I think it's just better to start thinking like of a more centralized version of like what people want. You know.
I kind of like that you said functions, like what the functions of police. That's what I want to open up to everybody. What do we think the functions of police should even be, like as an
Yeah,
organization?
I found it like interesting. If anybody else watched the like source materials that were in the link, Melvin Russell for the I love my job as a police officer for the TED Talk, I thought it was really interesting, kind of like how he described the way that police are trained. There's the protect and serve, and he kind of gave the analogy of like the protecting is they put so many hours into it as like this protection is a strong arm, but like the service to the community is lacking. And so going out and like actually reaching out to the community, seeing what the community needs and how you can help them, as opposed to putting yourself in positions of power over that community. You want to work with them, you're not trying to be better than them. And I think that that's something that is really not focused on enough. And I think that that TED Talk had a really good discussion on how service needs to be emphasized more, because there's a lot of things that they're doing that they shouldn't be. I mean, why are police going out to deal with homeless people that may need resources such as like medical attention? Why are the police being called for issues like that? So it's, what is their service to the community? How are they serving the community as opposed to protecting it in a sense?
I thought, can people hear me?
Yeah.
No, I can.
Oh, wait. All right. Anybody else have thoughts? That's pretty astute, Carlos. I feel you.
Yeah, kind of going off of that, I feel like it's actually impossible for police to both protect and serve, especially when 90% of their training is on violent reactions, and there's really no way for them to proactively deal with issues. I feel like the role of police should be actually responding to known violent situations that they are trained. Either their training needs to change or the actual resources that are under the police forces need to change. I think hiring social workers and mental health professionals to respond to people either that are going through mental health episodes or something like that, like police. I don't know. Obviously, they're not trained to deal with those sorts of situations. And I feel like they kind of are this catch-all for responding to all of this. And they're really only trained to react in a way that's violent, when most of these situations just need to be de-escalated in a way that's nonviolent. So I think the police just don't have the resources or training. And I think that's something they could have dealt with, but they haven't.
What I would want to see is the type of training that's provided proportional to the type of incidents that are happening in the community, in the region, whatever. So if there's a lot of homeless folks in an area, then there's specific training on what are the needs of folks in South LA to work with those folks and make sure that we're interacting with them in a way that's not violent and purposely going out of your way you have to move 3 blocks away because now we need to do this in this area. So what I would, as there's needs in different places throughout the country, I would be curious to know, yes, to some extent you need to know how to handle a weapon, but is that worth the 90% of training when you're trying to actually serve the community?
Yeah, I think in thinking about role of police, as a whole, their role is to keep the community safe. But what's so like, so I was having a conversation with the DPS officer last month, and they said that their role is to keep students safe because they don't know the norms of the community that we're entering, like the South LA community. And so a huge thing needs to be like, who are the police officers protecting? I think it makes sense if they're protecting people who are maybe feel unsafe in the community that they're living in, but then there's also issues of when police officers are coming into a community and then just over policing the community themselves and aren't keeping people safe there. Also, like thinking about justice and how it's not being, like police officers aren't being held accountable to the standards they're protecting, like qualified immunity, is protecting police officers from lawsuits against them when they're not protecting I'm losing my train of thought. What I'm trying to say is that justice needs to be a balance, and I think in conversations that have been happening thus far in professional spaces that deal with like qualified immunity, they don't center the stories of people who are being harmed and are having injustice taken upon them because they're so focused on the police officers themselves. But it's like, where are the stories of like trauma or people who have been harmed by the police? I feel like that's what's missing.
Something that I was thinking about is the way that we deal with crime right now, I think is very reactionary. We wait for crime to occur and then police come in, and that's why there's usually like excessive force being used. But I think in terms of like what we need to shift is like actually stopping the root cause of crime, which comes down to mental health stuff, housing, and like education. And all that money is being allocated to force and police right now and not those sectors.
So I actually have been doing a bunch of research. Kind of, I think somebody had asked prior about like, oh, they'd be interested in knowing like what police training is like. And so I started doing a little bit of research on like what police training is like, from city to city, and then also how that compares to like for example, like armed force or like specialized armed force training, and like how people basically address those types of like chaotic situations, and how de-escalation procedures are basically more than 40% of what those people do. And then on top of that, they have to like plan out all these things that they do and continue to like recertify and keep doing all this stuff. But being a police officer, in their de-escalation procedures in large cities, a lot of people estimate that it's about less than 10% of their time is spent on de-escalation procedures. So it's like, you know, some people think that, you know, this idea of defunding the police actually might be problematic, because there needs to be more funding into basically progressing how police handle situations versus dealing with them in the exact wrong way and immediately meeting like potential, or like, I guess, you know, just with like curiosity, or just like, you know, what's going to happen with violence always, or just like being exceedingly tense. People who are like comfortable in situations, or who are like prepared for those types of things, they wouldn't be so tense if it was like that, right? You got to be prepared for those types of situations. But it clearly shows that like these people are not given the right tools that are needed to succeed in those, you know, in those times.
Yeah, I kind of have, so I've been trying to figure out how, like, what percent of police that are active are armed with a gun. And it's kind of hard to like figure out the exact numbers, but it's somewhere between like 95 and 99%. And I think a lot of what I think would be helpful is if when police are starting out, they like wouldn't be allowed to have a gun on them for a certain period of time when they're training, actually going to calls, like actually responding. And so obviously maybe they're with an officer who's been in service for a little bit longer, but that cop who doesn't have a gun has to learn how to respond to situations and de-escalate without that, you know, being at their waist. I think then they wouldn't be automatically just reaching for their gun every time that there's something that could scare them. And I think they just get used to that as kind of their security blanket, and they just don't really think about it. So I think if they had the opportunity to actually learn how to be on the job without having that be their only way to respond to any sort of violence, that's something that I've been thinking about. Obviously, I don't know really how that would be rolled out, but I think that could be helpful in actually having people gain skills in responding to issues.
Yeah, I think that it was interesting because also, like, if you watched the Trevor Noah talking about police, it also was really interesting because he kind of stated that the main proponent of the training is like a fear-based training, as if you are in danger every moment of every time you're in uniform. And that, I think that narrative needs to shift, because you're creating a tense work environment, and when you're on edge, your reactions and your cognitive processes are basically altered to not be able to function at full capacity under the stress that you're in. So I think shifting that narrative into how can we shift it from a fear-based program into something more progressive, something that is more service-oriented, something that you're viewing these people as people, not as criminals or violent people.
I guess along those lines, I don't know much about the situation at all. I don't know much about police and how they are trained, but I wonder, in thinking about how it's fear-based programming, what we've been mentioning mental health services a lot towards people who are in these violent situations, but what mental health services are offered towards police also, so that they don't react like this, and so that they can cope when they are in a situation like this, to be better professionals and better handle the situations that they're in. I mean, I don't know how much that would help or if that would be harmful, but my image of police in the southeastern part of the United States is that they're all big, buff, strong men who need mental health services but neglect it because it's such a stigma here. So I don't know what y'all think about that either.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. Like, police oftentimes, like, they're portrayed in a very specific light, right? Like, it's very like resolute, I guess would be a good way of putting it. Like, strong people, they don't waver. They're like supposed to be like very like have some type of like fortitude to them. But, like, with that being said, right? Like, what if you were that cop that's like, oh, I need like help for PTSD or whatever, something happens, and then like would other people shame you for that? Would that look unfavorably upon you? Would people start judging you for your like decision making capacity? Maybe, honestly, because more than anything, like we've talked a lot about, the stigmatizing of mental health and beyond, and how those like effects radiate. But I feel like if I were a cop, I could only imagine that like I wouldn't be super keen or interested, at least in put like I don't know, even me personally, right? Like, let's say I were going to a therapist, like I'm not gonna go like advertise that shit to every fucking human being on the side of the street and be like, yo, I'm in therapy. Like, it's personal. And I feel like when people, if you're gonna make that a part of the job, it's like you really got to be comfortable with everybody that's around you, and there's got to be kind of like this level of accountability where people are like, okay, well, you got to get your shit sorted out so that you're still good at your job. But I feel like there's probably plenty of like ostracizing that goes on within that community, being like, yo, if you go to a shrink, you're either a rat or you're like weird. I don't know. That's just what I think.
I think that one thing that's like often overlooked is just like the rate of violent crimes that actually exists in most American cities and places is like close to, it's like below 10%. Like in a lot of places, it's like maybe 4 to 5% of reported crimes. So I think fundamentally, like the supply of police officers that we have right now that are trained for all of those really egregious violent crimes just massively outweighs like really the demand of the crimes that happen. And I think that a lot of like, well, I think fundamentally like a lot of there needs to be like a shift in how police are trained, and like, yeah, they can have more mental health, training about like how to deal with different situations. I think no matter how much training you have, if it's still inside kind of like this larger structure of like police unions and like police forces, that it's just like very hard to reform. And I realize like complete abolition or whatever, like that takes a long time, and like it's like somewhat different than the conversation we're having. But I think that one way to like get closer to that is like we can't just have police that are like know how to deal with people that also have mental health issues. It's like the people that have guns or responding to violent crimes should fundamentally not be the same people that are dealing with like 96% of the rest of the things that are happening in a community. And so as long as we are going to try, I think, obviously feel free to disagree, I think as long as we're like trying to like reform people that often come into like the job of policing with a very specific kind of like notion of what they're going to be doing. There's obviously a lot of self-selection in like people that come into police forces, like ex-military people or people that, in some ways I think like are a little bit more prone to wanting to exercise some sort of control. I think as long as we're like still kind of pulling from that pool and like within all of these kind of racist structures that we know exist, it's like very hard to move forward and expect things to change. And I thought, well, Sherrod's point about like where and like how police are being trained was very interesting. I was listening to NPR or something the other day, and they were talking about how a lot of times it's not even the police like stations themselves in communities that are writing the guidebooks for them. It's like private companies that are selling manuals to these police stations, and then basically it's like a one size fits all kind of problem that turns into a larger issue when you actually have like very specific community community specific situations that arise that these police officers are like not adept to deal with because they're being sold manuals from like larger companies. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's just like hard to continue to like ask for reform from some of these people.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I worry that sometimes we as like a society aren't super cognizant of the point of when something isn't worth trying to fix anymore. And especially when it comes to like the funding of police, I can't help but think about like this ever-growing mental health crisis that we're in that is being amplified with more people confronting trauma that they have from police-related instances. And I think it gets to a point where I worry that we will continue investing in trying to fix the police when it's a system that can't necessarily be fixed, given that it's rooted in racist practices. And like Shri said, like I think the people that become police officers are not really trained to have that kind of power over a person. And I think that's why police officers often don't feel remorse for what they do, because they are put in a different power position in society that I don't really think anyone should have or any amount of training can fix. But at the same time, I'm not super aware of what is the point that we just give up on policing as a concept.
I mean, I guess kind of going off of that, like in your guys' opinion, what do you think a world with, I guess, like the perceived idea of like abolition of police would look like? Like, do you think that's a feasible reality that is achievable? Like, do you think that, you know, this kind of perpetuated idea of like in the media of like, oh, it'll just either be, it's either complete anarchy or law and order and there's like nothing in between. I'm actually super interested in hearing what you guys think about that.
I'm just typing some stuff in the chat for people to
Something
ponder
that I
over.
think about for this question is if we are gonna reduce a police force, those people are still gonna need jobs. And so can we transition some of those folks to different jobs that involve protecting and serving or whatever they wanted to come onto the force for, that still involves some type of community support that isn't necessarily, because if there's not a community need for that many officers that have that type of training for those specialized or not as likely events, can we transition people? Will they want to be transitioned? Well, like I'm thinking for like a local, like even a city level, if we were going to do it on a city level, how would that work? But what I wonder, what someone mentioned was, to what extent are people who are police officers, like they take value in that enforcement element of their job, and what will it take for the country as well as police unions, et cetera, to let go of that?
I think that brings up an interesting point. Thank you to everybody who's kind of contributed so far. I feel like there's a couple points that I kind of want to come back to from earlier in the conversation. So like we kind of been splitting it up a couple different like trains of thought, right? The big vein of like training and the idea of like training and training modification, training modulation, like would that even do anything? And then the idea of like the mindset or like the social shift, I think is another big piece that we've kind of touched on. But I want to move to this like third piece that's a little bit more tangible of like that people have touched on, of like the bureaucracy and like the police unions and whatever, like, and y'all don't even need to know like how all of the inner workings of like these structures really like work on like an intricate level, but you can just imagine government organizations that you know operate like this are like incredibly complex and incredibly driven by money. So like there's two comments that I kind of wanted to revisit, is like the idea of like privatization and like how the private sector really plays a role in like all of this. She kind of touched on like training manuals being sold by companies, and it doesn't really stop there. Like weapons training, you know, weapons, protective gear you know, everything down to literally body cameras, you know, everything down to like the staplers that the government buys for the police precincts. You know, like there is money involved in all of that. And I kind of wonder, you know, like if anybody has any thoughts on like how do we devolve, is that the word, disinvolve like the money in the private sector from like all of that, and do we think that that would make any difference, and like if so, how would, you know, the organizations even operate? Whatever y'all think.
There was an interesting like talk on the like privatization aspect in the Trevor Noah piece, or not the, in the Hassan Minaj piece, about how basically like in the privatization there, so there was privatization in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and once the like police department was barred from using the specific privatization, the police chief basically said that he was going to tell his people to do it on their own time outside of the police training. And it was like a very violent based training. So I think it's one of those things where it comes down to, regardless of like the training that's provided, is where like, does that prevent them from getting outside training with weapon training or anything like that? Like, does that change the fact that they can still receive a lot of these manuals or privatized classes outside of the realm of their own police department or academy?
I think if we're talking about privatization, we have to ask ourselves the question, like, where does it stop? Because if you look even farther downstream from police, you then get into prisons and prison privatization. And so you have to, I think it's really hard to section it off. It's kind of all encompassing. You have to look at it as a big picture, because when you look at prison privatization, for those of you who have seen the 13th, you're a little bit familiar with the concept of prison privatization. Would recommend if you haven't seen it.
It's on like every BLM, like all of those like playlists of like educate yourself resources. It's
13th is the first
very well made and very sad.
Yes. And so I feel like it's hard to just talk about the privatization of the police force separate from the prisons, because that's ultimately the pipeline that gets them there, right? So we need to think about like, okay, so when did private prisons start? How did they start? Why did they start? And then kind of dismantling, how do we function without them? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but that's kind of where my head was at.
I guess like coming from the other end of that as well, like I think about like if you're going to take out like the big money from the police, you have to like start with money, like private money in government. And like you're not really going to ever edge out big money from police if you can't get it out of government and politics first, because that all just like trickles down. So yeah, it's like definitely a bigger conversation on both ends, from like prisons to like government and politics. And I really don't know like which end you would start on or what it would have
What
to
do you
do.
think if you had to like think about it, if you were like carrying on that thought process, what do you think you would?
I mean, in my thought process, I would start on like the government end, but if you're talking about getting big money out of government, that's like a very big project you're taking on. So I mean, it's just like, I mean, we've seen a lot of that this year with just the like corruption, and like this is going in a very negative light, but like the corruption and like a private hand in our government and politicians and leaders and stuff, and how that impacts the police and police unions, and kind of vice versa as well.
One thing that I think is interesting, I think maybe Marcus might have said something about how to like get weapons out of police's hands, basically. But one thing that like the US does in other countries, like in post-war situations, is like DDR, I think is maybe the acronym, but I might have it wrong. It's like de-arm, de-escalate. It's like what we do to other states' security forces when like the security forces are usually like the perpetrators of, you know, war crimes or whatever might have happened in that conflict. And a lot of people were kind of talking about that in the context of what it might look like in the United States if police, like one way to think about reimagining like what our safety and security looks like means like a large scale kind of like de-arming, de-escalation, and like reorientation of security forces look like in the US. And it's like, I think it's very like hard for us to think about that happening here. But most other states, like a lot of other states in the international community, like often have to do that with, you know, their military forces or security forces that use excessive force against civilians, or like carrying out extrajudicial killings, which like is a lot of what we're seeing. So that's just like one practice that, I don't know, I guess like maybe could be pushed for. But in terms of like getting money out of policing, I think one tangible way is just like to research whatever institutions or like corporations that you're engaging with or working for. What are their ties to like the prison pipelines and prison labor, or like police forces, like the UC school system. Basically, like there was a whole case basically like a couple years ago where students found out that like a lot of their furniture that were used in like college classrooms were made by private prison, like the same companies, you know, that use labor from private prisons. And so like just like making sure you're kind of doing due diligence with like whatever you're interacting with, and like pushing for that, or like divesting from those institutions is like always an option, you know?
Yeah, kind of going off of that, I think this is obviously I think it starts and ends with the prisons, and I think that's where this whole revenue stream and complex, it's basically where it centers. But I think one of the things that makes me the most mad is that we as citizens and non-citizens pay $80 billion a year to the prison system. Obviously, a lot of those are run by private industries and private companies. So we're basically paying for these very corrupt institutions to make money from the taxes we pay. So obviously none of us want to be paying money to this corrupt system anyways. So I think obviously this is tackling a huge system, but I think eventually if we could get rid of the privatization of prisons and have the tax money that we're actually paying to the prison system filter down to communities and even to police forces, if they promise to reform how they hire, reform their training programs. But I think that's one of the things that makes me the most mad, is that we don't have a choice in, you know, where our tax money goes, and we're basically having to pay money to this extremely corrupt prison system that ends up allowing these institutions to profit off of us. And none of that money filters down to prisoners. None of it goes towards lowering recidivism rates. So I think obviously this would take a lot of time and voting and kind of transforming the whole system. But eventually I think if we could end that private aspect of the prison system and have that money filter down to actual communities and actual police forces, I think that would be the goal. That's obviously reaching for the stars as things currently stand.
Absolutely. Anybody else on that point? I want to turn it back to de-arming, to what she said, the de-escalating, de-arming. And like a very simple question is like, do we think that de-arming police would actually be a good idea? I know we can say all we want, you know, like 4%, 5% of crimes, only 4% or 5% of crimes are violent, but like, what about those 4 or 5% of crimes that are violent? Like, you know, are we just like sending people in there unarmed to like assess and like, what does that even, you know, I personally think like that'd be kind of insane if we just said like, nope, cops don't get guns anymore. But what do y'all think?
I think oftentimes in policing, there's like a very big rush to solve problems like immediately after they're found out. And I think that as a profession, it lacks a lot of patience and discipline. And that leads to it being like very messy in its work. So I think that like and we kind of touched on this earlier, like the training that like you will be in those situations like every single time that like makes officers like live in fear is very much like a false narrative that only becomes true when cops themselves perpetuate that. So I think that it makes more sense for the profession to be like more thoughtful in like its work, and if there is like a violent situation, that it's not like we need to fix it like immediately, but like to do it in a more like peaceful and like humanity focused manner.
I think also that the like maybe I think it'd be a bit like I think there'd be a lot of pushback on the idea of having like no police have weapons. But I do think if we're talking about 4 to 5% of crimes being these violent crimes that might necessitate use of, you know, if it's like someone else, like a citizen with a gun, then obviously you wouldn't want to send unarmed people there. But I do think it should be more proportional. If only 4 to 5% of crimes would even necessitate having someone with a weapon present, then only 4 to 5%, or maybe a little bit more of officers should be carrying weapons per se. And if we're like in an ideal situation, you have mental health, like mental health counselors responding to mental health crime or mental health like episodes or situations, then you could also, there should be a way to have the right level of weapon, like of armed response to certain crimes, because I definitely don't think every situation requires someone with a weapon present, and I also don't think it necessarily makes people more comfortable in every situation to know that someone is there with a weapon, and I think it should be a privilege. I think you should have to show that you can handle situations, and that way you don't have people going into the career because they want to be carrying a weapon or they want the power and authority that a weapon would give them. You have them actually going into it to want to serve instead.
One comment I would have, like based on just removing guns from the police forces, I think as long as a private American can buy a gun, they have to have guns. That's kind of one of the reasons it works in other countries, is that they don't have the Second Amendment and a random person cannot just easily access a gun. And so I think that in the United States, I don't think the Second Amendment will ever be removed. And so, or at least not in our lifetimes. I think as long as that is true, there's not a realistic world in which the police force in its entirety would be able to be gun-free the way some other countries are. I mean, maybe segmented, but not in its entirety.
This is Nicole, by the way.
Hi. Sorry, I was listening out of frame.
What's up, Nicole? Yeah, I guess I'll kind of going off of that. I think it's kind of to a point that Sri was making about this kind of one size fits all policy on how people police, and like there's only one way to address certain situations, and like everybody should be equipped to handle every single situation. It's just like realistically, it's not possible, right? Like when you get into the professional sphere, like whatever job you're doing, like there's like a certain degree of specialization that happens, like in order for you to be proficient, right? And so the thing is, like with police, right? I think that not every single cop is equipped to handle like all the high pressure situations. Like, you know, there's some like cops that are like desk cops forever, and like that's not a bad thing. Like the thing is, people need to stop thinking that every single person needs to handle everything all in the same way. So like for example, what Siri was saying with the 4 to 5% on it, crime being violent crime, right? Like, I realistically then, to Lexi's point, how like there shouldn't be that much more than 10% of people that are have been deemed like capable of handling those situations do that. And you know, it's I think it's reasonable for people to have that expectation. And like moreover, as you start like, especially I think once the George Floyd protests and all this other stuff started happening, people started interrogating where's the budgeting and all like in policing going. It's like for a lot of like large cities, the majority of the money is going to arming the police, not to do with training, not to do with like entertaining the community or understanding like what the needs or like services are. It's all towards like it like increasing tension and like creating more violence, right? Like, so I just think that like shift needs to be like considered before, you know, moving.
Yeah, I think at the very least, like there can be like a massive reallocation of where funds are going right now. Like police forces and like the DoD for that fact, like their budgets have been inflated so much for a lot in a lot of cases that when we propose cuts, everyone's like, oh my God, this is gonna like gut, you know, the safety of the community, which it's not true. They've been increasing so steadily that like when you do propose a cut back to like a normal rate, it just seems drastic. And I think the other thing is like, if like a lot of confrontations that happen between like the community and the police often happen, you know, on like daily patrols, like where they're just like assigned this function to like police communities. And I think that's like one thing that like you can very much trace back to like racist origins, right? And so like kind of the like day-to-day functions of policing can also be rethought. And I think that's just as important as figuring out like who gets guns or whatever. I think like if you're doing a routine, if your job is to be in a community, try to ensure like some semblance of like safety there on a daily basis, like you don't need a gun if you're like walking around a playground, right? Unless you were like fully sure or something that there's going to be a violent altercation there. And like that's, I think, often like these kind of day-to-day responsibilities that like we think are like just a given also can be rethought and like perhaps gotten rid of in a lot of cases.
I just wanted to say something about like, I guess pushing back a little bit on it, because I feel like it's important not only to talk about like what we think is going to happen, but also like what the other side, or I guess the other argument would be, said like we're gonna, like we brought up the argument that like a police officer doesn't need to have a gun at a playground, but like, I mean, I don't know, like I'm a senior in high school, school shootings are definitely a concern. So we threw out like the number like 10% of police officers should like reasonably have a weapon. I'm stumbling over my words. But like, how do we choose that 10%? And then when we give that 10% like a weapon, like how do we make sure that like now like giving them a weapon doesn't like, I guess, strengthen them or like make like a Superman complex?
I think that's a good point, but I mean, again, kind of just like anything else, it's just like I feel like it'll just have to be like a certification quality, right? Like, not everybody can be like, for example, not every single person is like has the mental acuity to be like a Navy SEAL, right? Or like is in that like is in the right headspace frame, capable of doing that type of stuff. Like, and in that same frame, like not every single cop is capable of being, you know, I'm saving people from school shootings. I think, like. I don't know. Maybe that's just
no, but I think to Sid's point though, like I do really question, you know, when we talk about like, okay, some people get it, some people don't. Like, what is a mental aptitude test? Like, if we're talking about gun background checks, like those are practically non-existent. Like for my friends that are in the psychology fields, like help me out. I don't know for all the specific details or whatever, but as far as I know, it's pretty easy. You know, there's a very limited, you know, check that is associated with like being able to purchase a gun as a private citizen. And so additionally, if police officers already are assumed to be this like highly trained force, like right now, let's take like right now as police officer to say like, okay, we're going to do a survey or some sort of test or certification that says only 10% of you or only X amount of you will continue to hold a firearm or whatever, and you'll be assigned to this like particular unit that gets called for like more violent crimes or something like that, I think the Superman complex could get very real. And those people get like an A-team mentality where like they're just out here dealing with the or like a Hawaii 5-0 mentality, you know, like they play by nobody's rules and they're the ones with the AR-15 so they can do whatever they want and nobody can really stop them. You know what I mean? That was more like to anybody.
I feel like also, as long as a private citizen can buy a gun, then what's to stop every other police officer who now has an inferiority complex going and buying their own personal gun and having that with them, instead of the one that's given by the force. And also just like on the mental health checks, like one thing that's really important with mental health is it doesn't help you unless you're open to it, willing to actually genuinely, honestly participate. And so it's very, if you have someone who's a certain level of intelligence, it's very easy to game those questions, you know? So at a level, like how can you trust some of those tests at a point if not everyone's agreeing to actually be honest?
And beyond that, with gun shows, you don't have to take a mental health test. You can just go in and buy a gun and it doesn't matter who you are. So that's another question about how do we monitor who's actually having guns, because gun shows, there's no record, there's no mental health check. It's just anyone can go in and get whatever they want.
And to go back to the point that was just made about like what prevents say the 10% were to get guns, what prevents the officer from going and purchasing their own gun off duty and bringing that with them on duty. There are like rules within the police department as of now. You can't actually have an off-duty weapon on you during your duty because that's against the law. However, because of qualified immunity, that you run into weird instances where the system kind of works against all these things, like all these proposed like changes.
Beyond that, for me, it's like if you pick 10% right now, like you're gonna have more qualified people like rolling in. Like that's just a matter of like, you know, people rise in their profession. So like, what are you gonna take like the lowest 2% and say like you guys are like 2% alternates, and like we're gonna start like cycling in like 2% in, 2% out. Like how do you pick and maintain 10%? Because otherwise you have like 10% plus 2% plus 2%, and then eventually we get back to our whatever, like 95 to 99.
I feel like it's kind of hard to visualize with percentages, but I think that policing as a system would be a lot more effective if it was like community based, if it was like decentralized. Like I think this was mentioned earlier, like to local communities that understand what is happening in that community, rather than this kind of like one size fits all. And I think that there could very well be like cops, like a good majority of cops that live in like, I don't know, like an urban city that don't need a gun on them at all. And I think that if we break it, like the more we break down the components into smaller pieces, I think it would become more obvious like which police officers would like need a gun, and then those percentages would fill themselves.
I think these are all definitely great points, and we're definitely getting into a little bit of like the nitpicky with like the de-arming and all of that. I kind of want to turn it back to one more a little bit broad scale thing, and then we'll kind of wrap it up because we do want to stick to at least close to an hour. But root us back in like our original question, right? The role of police, thinking more along the lines of day-to-day function. Somebody mentioned that earlier. Like, what should the day-to-day function be then? If they're not walking the beat, are they then like a surveillance body that only intervenes when something happens? Like, I don't know what that would look like, but I kind of want to hear some thoughts about that, and then we'll kind of take it out for the day.
I think to sort of limit the control of power that police have, I think it's important for people to approach them when they have a problem. So like, you know, dialing in, responding to 911 calls. But again, I think with 911 calls, we go back to this conversation of like, police shouldn't always respond to every call that people make for fears about their security.
I think like an important aspect that should happen is like community engagement, like engaging with the communities that they're working within, and not approaching people because they look suspicious and things like that, but like actually getting to know their community, presenting themselves to the community as a force to serve them, so that people are more comfortable approaching them and interacting with them in a way that they don't feel as if they're trying to be controlled, or as if the police officers emitting fear into that community. They're really there to support the community.
I think that one like kind of obvious function that could be broken off as like its own sector is just strictly, and then Nicole said they do it in South Africa, is just traffic stops. Like traffic police are only traffic police, like they do routine stops or like speeding violations, rolling stop signs, those types of things.
Yeah, like my parents when we immigrated were like, what is this? What do you mean they can do anything to us? And it's not like a punishment as well. Then there's not a weird resentment towards those kinds of duties and like looking for something bigger. Yeah, like traffic cops just do traffic. That's all they do. They're not qualified to do anything else.
That's it. Maybe we just make them all traffic cops. You know, I'll take a speeding ticket over a bullet any day. And that's all I'm gonna say on that matter. Thank you to everybody who participated. It is getting a little late. We started around 5:10, so it is about an actual legitimate hour. Thank you everybody who pulled through, who registered through the Eventbrite and everything. Please do spread the word, spread the message. If you can't be here, try and replace yourself with one or maybe even two people. You know, maybe even a second person. And we'll definitely be continuing as long as like we have, well, there will always be things to talk about, right? But as long as there are people to talk about them with, you know, we'll probably be here. Honestly, we're still trying to like figure out exactly what this is building towards, but at least for right now, we have next Sunday, the Sunday after that, and then the kind of live stream event that will probably just be like Sherrod and myself and some guest speakers, and that'll just be like live on whatever social media or however that will work. But more details and more fun logos to come. If anybody has any last thoughts, feel free to go ahead and share while we're still live for the last couple seconds before I go ahead and stop it all.
I was just gonna say thank all y'all for you know being comfortable. You know, if you participated when you guys had the in the itch too, it was cool. I'm really glad that everybody felt, or I hope everybody felt like this was a good space to, you know, at least talk about some shit that you don't necessarily get to all day long. And like, I know I'm just like most mornings when I'm like reading or watching the news, I'm just like yelling to myself. So I feel like it's always good to just get like a little bit of, you know, at least a little bit of like yell back. So I'm glad everybody came.
Yes, thank you all. All right. Well, I'll stick around in case anybody wants to chat for a few minutes, catch up. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and